We're going to continue with Karen Spierling's Infant Baptism in Reformation Geneva, The Shaping of a Community, 1536 to 1564. If you haven't bought this already, you probably should. We are in the first chapter, which happens to be the introduction, and this is going to be the second half, which begins with defining community. Following chapters demonstrate that raising children in Reformation Geneva was, to a great extent, a community effort. Indeed, one encompassing a variety of communities. This assertion requires some clarification of my use of the term community. It has become increasingly common in the last decade of the Reformation scholarship to examine the relationship between church community and civic community. For example, describing the tensions over poor relief between city governments and Calvinist church leaders in Holland, Charles Parker explains, quote, "Although authority assumes the prominent place in these deliberations, disputes over authority connoted a deeper disagreement over what actually constituted the Christian community during this momentous period in Dutch history. That is, quarrels over the borders between civil and ecclesiastical jurisdictions arose out of a more fundamental controversy about the very nature of society." Unquote. That's from Charles Parker's book, The Reformation of Community, Social Welfare, and Calvinist Charity in Holland. Continuing, similarly, we will find in Geneva that even within one population, Geneva consisted of a variety of communities, or more precisely, many Genevans considered themselves part of a number of different communities, which may have overlapped, but were not always one and the same. For the purposes of this study, I've taken not only church and city as possible communities, but also family networks, and that sometimes cross both religious and civic boundaries, but still constituted a widespread community from the viewpoint of early modern Genevans. These definitions of the Genevan community clashed outright when native Genevans resisted and fought against the growing power of the ministers and the Reformed Church in the 1540s and 1550s. These, quote, rebels considered themselves faithful Christians and citizens of Geneva, but they were not prepared to consent to being a part of a community that was under the religious authority of Jean Calvin and his colleagues. Again, I guess by way of reminder, Karen likes to use the French spelling of John, but not the last name is not changed. But even Genevans who did not resist the Reformed Church authority so publicly or adamantly sometimes considered their membership in the Genevan Reformed Church as only one part of their identity. Being a pious member of the Reformed Church was not the first priority for all Genevans. But this does not mean that those same individuals considered themselves without a community. As well as belonging to the community of Reformed churches and Reformed Christians, most Genevans also operated as part of a family community, one which sometimes was vital to their economic survival. The key to this understanding of community is that while the Genevan community, as they defined it, in practice, The key to this understanding of community is that while some Genevans argued for the primacy or even singularity of the Genevan community, as they defined it, in practice, Genevans may have considered themselves to be operating within a number of communities simultaneously. While individual 16th century Genevans may never have stopped to even think about such an issue, their actions and words, as evidenced in their interactions with church and city officials, demonstrate the complexity of their priorities and the place of the Reformed Church in their lives. Thus, the following chapters will examine some of the tensions that resulted from varying definitions and understandings of community. For the civic leaders of the newly independent Geneva, the most important community was that of the Republic of Geneva. The first loyalty of any citizen needed to be Geneva. Many of these civic leaders considered the church, under Calvin's leadership, to be an important tool for ensuring the stability and survival of their civic community. And the baptismal ceremony was the first step in this. The baptismal registries of the Genevan churches served as birth records, which could be used to confirm the baptism of a child and the names of the parents who were to be held responsible for the upbringing of that child. For Calvin and the Genevan ministers, however, the principal community to stabilize and defend was that of true Christians. Baptism was undoubtedly an important tool in defining, disciplining, and preserving this community as well. The situation was further complicated since, for the parents of the children baptized in Geneva, the primary community varied. Some parents chose to have their children baptized according to Reformed practice, specifically because it was a public acknowledgement of their own membership and good standing in the church, and of their child's inclusion in that church community. Others, however, preferred Catholic baptism, whether for reasons of faith or convenience. Some even attempted to present Catholic friends or relatives as godparents. And this study examines the effects of these varying priorities on the interactions among city, church, and parents in Reformed Geneva. She's using the term community for church community. The Reformed tradition would refer that to the covenant community or covenant family, but Reformed communities. Exploring the definition of community in Geneva, this book endeavors to contribute to the growing literature on Reformed communities in early modern Europe, particularly in the 16th and 17th centuries. The past decade, studies have appeared on many of the main Calvinist areas of 16th and 17th century Europe, including Scotland, England, Emden, the Netherlands, and various areas in France. All of these works have significantly improved our understanding of how these communities created and sustained themselves, how they related to surrounding Catholic communities, and how they interacted with other Reformed communities in Europe, most often Geneva, especially in the case of France and England. Many of these communities viewed Geneva as a model, and yet the development of each was distinctively affected by its own context. In view of such variations, one can say most precisely that Reformed theology and practice, as it developed in Geneva, served as the theological, liturgical, and organizational foundation for Reformed churches elsewhere. I got to put some more wood on the fire. I'm burning some Palo Verdes. They have needles that are like hypodermic needles, and they are best burnt. Okay. Continue on page 20. A number of the above-mentioned studies explore the difficulties faced by religious communities that constituted a minority of a given population, or that had to coexist with Catholics, or with Reformed Christians in the case of Cuy's article, within the same civic boundaries. They observe, on the one hand, the strict disciplining of the Reformed community in order to maintain a pious and unassailable position in the community, and on the other hand, the need for flexibility in order to exist in a mixed Christian society. On the subject of discipline, several scholars also have observed that it was the Reformed communities beyond Geneva, including England, Emden, and Scotland, that discipline first became an official mark of the true church. While discipline was fundamental to Calvin's concept of the Christian community and to the implementation of the Reformation in Geneva, he did not make it a mark of the true church or of a true church. So let me pause for a sec. So that's an interesting point. The one of the marks of a true church is not discipline in Geneva, although I don't think Calvin would have disputed that, particularly given the nature of discipline in Geneva. A number of scholars have interpreted this point as an important distinction between Geneva and other Reformed communities. For example, Michael Graham asserts, quote, while much of the language of the Scots Confession was conventionally Calvinist, in some respects it went beyond the teaching of Calvin himself. Not only was resistance to tyranny made a duty, but discipline took on a more fundamental importance than Calvin ever gave it. And yet, as we'll see, both the notion of discipline and its enforcement were themselves a fundamental element in negotiating the definition of the Reformed community in Geneva. But, just as Todd perceives in Scotland, so in Geneva, some degree of flexibility in the exercise of that discipline was one of the keys to the success and survival of the Reformed Church. In the case of Geneva, we will discover that flexibility within community affairs, rather than in dealings with people outside of the Genevan community, whether defined by church or city. This book builds upon the work of these scholars in examining the functioning of a Reformed community and the interplay of religious, social, and economic concerns. The following chapters strive to keep theological ideas and concerns integrated in their discussion of baptism and children, rather than simply setting out theological ideas as the necessary introductory background and then leaving them there as a faint memory in the reader's mind. Many of these above-mentioned scholars have also recognized the need to acknowledge religious belief as a valid motivating factor in the understanding of these historical communities and the individuals that operated within them. For example, after emphasizing the importance of acknowledging an economic impetus for the immigration the emigration of English Protestants to Emden. Pedigree, that's his last name. It's not spelled like what you'd think it would be spelled like. It's Petteggree. Pedigree then asserts, quote, nevertheless, there is a danger in going to the opposite extreme and denying the sincere religious component in the exile. In every exile community, there was a core for whom the religious cause was of overriding importance, unquote. In its close examination of baptism, the most basic element in defining all of the various Reformed communities in early modern Europe, the present book seeks a synthesis of the possible extremes in interpretation. The overarching question asked here is how various concerns, including religious belief, interacted with one another to influence the practice of baptism and the definition of community in Geneva. Consistories. All of these studies of Reformed communities rely upon the records of consistories, the morals court connected to Reformed churches, made up of ministers and church elders in various proportions, depending upon the community. These court records have been fundamental in shaping the scholarship of the past 2 decades, and they've not begun to be fully exploited. Across Western Europe, Reformed church members were called for consistories for causes ranging from ignorance of Reformed doctrine to mistreatment of family members. Consistory cases provide insight into the operations of the church discipline, the concerns of ministers and lay leaders of a given church, and the dynamics operating within families and between individuals and authorities. If we are to understand the ways in which Reformed theology and ideas were put into practice, and the ways in which church members influenced and modified those ideas, consistory registries are a vital resource. These records are not, however, unproblematic as historical sources. The use of consistory records has now become sufficiently common for the effective method of utilizing them to have become an important topic of discussion among Reformation and early modern historians. In the case of Geneva, the consistory records received minimal attention for the first half of the 20th century, largely because of the difficulty of reading them. Reformation historians generally relied minimally on the consistory registers, except to refer to the published excerpts that became a standard part of the city's history. Since the 1960s, however, Robert Kingdon, who has written many, many books on related matters, and William Monter have helped to stimulate interest in these records among international scholars. During the first decades of renewed attention to these records, scholars focused on quantitative analysis and the compilation of statistics in order to determine what kind of issues consistories addressed and how they dealt with the individuals called before them. Such studies are of fundamental importance for providing a sense of the types of cases most often addressed by consistories, and suggesting changes in focus over a period of years or decades. Most recently, however, scholars have begun to raise questions regarding the suitability of statistical analyses of consistory records. Based on her work with the consistory records of the Reformed Church of Utrecht, Judith Pullman, Pollman, argues strongly for a rethinking of scholars' reliance on consistory records as a tool for quantifying the disciplinary practices of early modern churches and communities. She concludes, and this is a quote from Pullman's book, our comparison of the Utrecht consistory minutes with Bucelius's journals suggests that church records cannot be read as representative or objective reflection of the activities of Reformed consistories. First, one cannot maintain that they record all activity of the consistory. Secondly, I have suggested that the records give us a flattering picture of the relationship between church and secular authorities, as well as that between lay people and their ministers in the Dutch Golden Age. And most importantly, Bucelius's journals shows us how hazardous it is to try and use consistory records to measure the intensity of discipline and changes over time, unquote. I don't know if I necessarily agree with some of the conclusions, but the principle of the consistory records not being entirely precise as far as reflection of what's taking place seems reasonable. It would be like using the minutes from a session meeting or from presbytery to get a general feel of what those meetings were like. There's obviously greater depth to those meetings in themselves, and the minutes are just a drop. Okay, Pullman is not calling for a dismissal of consistory records as valid sources, but rather for a method of use that does not rely on counting numbers of cases and expecting those numbers to reflect reality more or less exactly. Other scholars have already begun to demonstrate other possible techniques. Perhaps most significantly, what has long been dismissed as merely anecdotal evidence is now being examined as worthy and profitable source material. For an example, Raymond Mentzer, Mentzer, has recently published an article centered on the discussion of a single case and its repeated appearances in the consistory records of Montauban, France. In defending this approach, Mentzer states, quote, "The close reading of the scandal at Montauban, supplemented with other relevant material, conveys information that might elude a simple statistical study. It illuminates details about how cases came before the consistory, how church officials pursued their inquiries, how authorities molded the language of consistorial admonition, and how individual men and women reacted when faced with consistorial investigation. Above all, the events associated with this instructive case provides a glimpse into the attitudes about sexuality and related matters that characterize the early modern community," end quote. Margot Todd has taken a similar approach with great success in her extensive study on Scotland in her The Culture of Protestantism. She, too, asserts the importance of using such records not as a source of numbers or statistics, but rather as one to be read carefully and thoroughly with great attention to both the information and the nuance of detail that they provide. In discussing her use of Scottish Kirk session minutes, Todd states outright, quote, "They will not do at all for a statistical study. This study therefore eschews any pretense to statistical investigation," unquote. Nonetheless, the final result is a complex picture of the establishment of the Reformation in Scotland and the cultural shifts that resulted. The present book seeks to further this initiative to make effective, but not quantitative, use of consistory records. Attempting to compile statistics about baptism, a topic that appears sporadically in the registers, results in more questions than answers. Close readings of the cases that do exist, however, tell us a great deal about the significance of baptism in Reformed Geneva, and about the issues raised in the discussions and arguments connected to baptism. As a result, with the exception of a brief examination of one Genevan baptismal registry, this study does not aspire to provide a quantitative analysis. Rather, it asserts that a qualitative discussion makes the most effective use of the records under consideration in order to illustrate the place of baptism and children in 16th century Geneva. More specifically, in combination with the Registre du Conseil, say it with enough authority, people maybe don't question, but that's translated as the records of the Genevan City Council. The consistory records present a wide variety of Genevans who interacted with both church and civil and city authorities. Granted, an official of the city council or consistory recorded each entry, so some questions remains as to just how clearly we are hearing the voices of the individuals speaking. In addition, it is likely that the setting of an appearance before either of these bodies would have constrained both the speech and behavior of those being questioned. Nonetheless, many of these personalities involved appear consistent throughout the hands of different secretaries and different records. Certainly, these sources take us one step closer to the population of Geneva than do sources such as the letters or sermons of John Calvin, which, while invaluable in their own right, reveal quite distinctively Calvin's own view of what was occurring. I'll put some more fire on. I said put more fire on. I meant more wood on the fire. Okay, Geneva. This discussion brings us to the final area to which this book intends to contribute, and that's the history of Geneva itself. The mid-16th century was a critical period in Genevan history, religiously, politically, and socially. By 1536, the city had declared itself politically independent and had broken with the Catholic Church. The firm establishment of the Reformation during the 1540s, as well as increasing religious tensions in other areas of Europe, made Geneva an attractive destination for religious refugees. At the height of this period of immigration, the population of Geneva nearly doubled from 10,000 in the 1530s to about 17,000 during the 1550s and 1560s. This resulted in an overcrowded city that was economically vital but struggling to maintain social order and financial stability. Political and religious revolution followed closely upon one another's heels in 1530s Geneva. Until then, the city had its own Catholic bishop and remained uneasily under the influence of the Catholic Duke of Savoy. In 1532, ministers such as William Farel began to preach the Reformation in the city. In 1536, the city leaders, with the assistance of the city of Bern, a member of the Swiss League, declared themselves free of the rule of both the bishop and the Duke of Savoy. Soon, the two goals, political independence and religious freedom, became intertwined. It was by no means an easy union, but Geneva's establishment of the Reformation in May of 1536 helped to solidify its alliance with Bern, a reformed city. Furthermore, the new church provided a potential foundation for the social stability anxiously sought by the new leaders of Geneva. In that same year, Farel convinced Jean Calvin, a young French scholar who was passing through the city, to stay in Geneva and help him lead the Reformation there. He convinced. The story is great if you don't know it. In Calvin, some city leaders found just the rigorous and determined, if initially reluctant, leadership they were looking for, but things did not begin smoothly. Calvin chafed when the city insisted on maintaining rituals like those practiced in Bern, such as using a baptismal font instead of a simple bowl for the water in the baptismal ceremony. He and Farel insisted on the minister's authority in excommunicating church members, a right the council members viewed as their own. Yep, the city leaders, perhaps understandably protective of their newly independent authority, exiled Calvin and Farel from Geneva in 1538. In doing this, the Genevan magistrates disregarded the pleas even of their defenders in Bern, who welcomed the two men and sent a request to the Genevans to reconsider their decision. And then it was 2 years later, Calvin's supporters convinced the council that the success of their independent republic depended upon the moral and disciplinary leadership of Calvin himself. They sent repeated invitations to Calvin, now residing in Strasbourg, where he was content as the new minister of a French church. He strongly resisted, but eventually prompted once again by Farel, Calvin agreed to return to Geneva in the autumn of 1541. The book I'm doing concurrently is Calvin's response to Cardinal Sadoleto, or Sadolet, and he was writing this during his time in Strasbourg. Once there, that is, in Geneva, Calvin set about first ordering the church institution and in turn the Society of Geneva, and then in time building a community of refugees and training ministers to spread the Reformation beyond the immediate surroundings of the city, particularly into France. Tensions remained between the ministers and some council members, but ultimately the city came to rely upon Calvin and his colleagues for guidance in maintaining a morally grounded, stable society. And by 1555, with the defeat of Jean Calvin's most outspoken opponents, church and city drew very close, without ever becoming one and the same entity. Here then we have the perfect setting in which to study the phenomenon of infant baptism. From the start, the Reformation in Geneva was a collaboration between the city and church authorities. The relationship between church and city was certainly tense at times and even contentious, but both authorities shared the quality and the goal of creating and maintaining a stable society. While they frequently argued over the particulars of what that stability entailed, in large part they shared a vision, and infant baptism was the starting point for the perpetuation of that vision. Here they located the moment at which a new member was introduced into the community of a church and city, and the framework was set for the education and nurture of a prospective faithful church member and Genevan citizen. It's interesting, they're saying infant baptism was the starting point for the perpetuation of that vision, as if it was independent of any sort of theological conviction. She's alluded to this already, that she's trying to be more what's the word I'm looking for? She's trying to be more anthropological than theological, or at least not trying to divorce one from the other. But I wonder if that's going to get her into trouble, because the motive was theological. And so I don't know that it was a perpetuation of the vision to unify into communities more than it was a theological conviction that had that as a consequence. Maybe I'm overthinking that, but something to consider. Traditionally, historical works on Geneva focused on the political movement for independence and the religious movement for Reformation, and on the interaction between those two forces. Jean Calvin looms large in these works, and the majority of them are either near hagiographies by Calvinist scholars or critical attacks by either Catholic scholars or defenders of the native Genevans who supposedly put the freedom of their city above religious concerns. For example, in the late 16th century, Florimond de Raymond, a Catholic clergyman and scholar, produced an extensive analysis of the practices and theology of the Reformed churches. Calvin was not his only target, but Raymond did not hesitate to reveal what he saw as the absurdities and hypocrisies of Calvin and the Genevan church. That's Florimond de Raymond. 1628 to 1629, he wrote a history of, it's in French, so I don't have the ability to translate that, but I would love to read that and get an appreciation for what he construes as absurdities and hypocrisies. Several centuries later, Émile de Murge composed his many-tomed history of Calvin and Geneva, in which Calvin is clearly a heroic figure and Geneva a chosen city. Works such as de Murge's provide an imposing wealth of detailed information and are fundamental to the ongoing study of Genevan history. But they tell the history of a city and republic as the story of the political and religious leaders of the time. Scant attention is paid to the wider population of Geneva, or to the forces of interaction between that population and the men more visible in the city records. This trend began to change significantly in the 1960s with the aforementioned work of Kingdon and Monterre. Instead of relying on published excerpts from the consistory and council records, both of these scholars entered the archives to sift through original papers. The results were studies that fleshed out the workings of the consistory, the church, and the city government, and began to shed light on the interactions of ordinary Genevans with those authorities. Most recently, Thomas Lambert and Christian Grosse, Grosse, have produced dissertations based upon the intensive combining of archival records and aimed at providing a wider and more complicated sense of establishment of the Reformation in Geneva. Lambert's study Preaching, Praying, and Policing in the Reform in 16th century Geneva examines not only the structures established by the Reformed ministers, but also the effectiveness of the changes they made. I don't know when Lambert published his book, the endnotes. The footnotes don't say. Anyway, he concludes that the reform in Geneva was not as perfect or as absolute as it was sometimes reputed to have been, and that Genevans continued to find opportunities to maintain some Catholic practices. Still, he asserts that by 1560, the vast majority of Genevans had learned the basic tenets of the Reformed Church and had accepted the authority of that church. Grosse takes on an anthropological historical approach to his study. He examines in great details the changes in the religious practices and rituals established by the Reformers, challenging the traditional assertion that Protestants replaced a religion of ritual with one of the Word. Instead, Grosse demonstrates that Reformed Christianity was still a religion of ritual and one in which time, space, and actions mattered a great deal. The fact that a number and elaboration of those rituals may have been constricted in comparison to Catholic practice did not mean that they were less important. In some ways, the remaining rituals became that much more significant. Both of these works result from extensive and meticulous archival research which significantly expands our understanding and conception of Reformed Geneva. Both demonstrate the interaction involved in establishing the Reformation there, showing clearly that whatever the original vision laid out by Jean Calvin and his colleagues, adjustments were required along the way. Those modifications resulted from a process of negotiation, not only among church and city leaders, but with church members and city inhabitants as well. The present book endeavors to make a similar contribution, with at least one significant difference. It, too, results from intensive work in the archives, particularly with the registers of the consistory and the council, and it seeks to provide a broader picture of the first decades of the Reformation in Geneva, revealing further nuances of the process of negotiation and compromise that produced a stable and lasting Reformed church in Geneva. It also further illuminates the operations of the consistory and its interaction with the city. But in contrast to Lambert's and Gross's work, this book strives to incorporate more fully a discussion of the theological underpinnings of the Reformation into an analysis of baptism and the place of children in Reformed Geneva. Rather than setting aside theology as sometimes detached from the reality of social and political interactions, the following chapters take a premise that theological ideas were intrinsic to the development of the Genevan Reformation on all levels. Jean, I would obviously agree with that, and that clarifies the thought I was having earlier. Jean Calvin's vision for a reformed community was supported by his colleagues, and the consistory was deeply rooted in his theological understanding of the relationship between God and humanity. And more often than one might expect, resistance to the demands of the consistory was articulated more or less clearly as a criticism of some point of that theology. Thus, a complete understanding of the arguments and confrontations regarding baptism in children requires that theology be taken into consideration. This is not, however, to say that theology of the Reformers was absolute. The following pages also argue that just as theological ideas drove the ministers' interactions with lay Genevans, the demands and behavior of these Genevans helped to shape the articulation of Reformed doctrine. I wonder where, it's interesting because she's using British spelling of words like behavior. This book was printed in the U.S. She is an American living in the U.S. Well, it does make you wonder, but it's okay. I digress. Finally, this book seeks to expand the literature on the history of Geneva by addressing the subject of the practice of infant baptism and the related care of children. John Riggs' recent book addresses the topic of Calvin's baptismal doctrine, but until now, no scholar has devoted a work entirely to the enactment of that doctrine within the context of 16th century Geneva. Similarly, a number of scholars have recently begun to write on topics involving the children of Geneva, but none take baptism as their starting point. My hope is that this will be only the first in a growing number of books addressing issues concerning children and families in the 16th century. Yeah. I think that would be quite fascinating. Okay, we're down to the last page, more or less. Shape of the argument. In its examination of all the above-mentioned issues, this study pursues the following path. Chapter 2 explores the medieval background of the sacrament of baptism and the development of Jean Calvin's baptismal liturgy, both of which underlay the baptismal disputes in Geneva. The third chapter, so the shaping of the 16th century Reformation baptismal rite, something like this. That's another book we're currently going through by Hughes, Oliphant Old. That's already been alluded to, I think, in this book as well. Addresses the same material as it sounds like chapter 2 is going to cover. The third chapter moves into the archival sources, addressing some of the ways in which medieval baptismal traditions persisted in Geneva, often in resistance to the church authorities and at times with their implicit consent. Chapter 4 considers the issues of godparents, seeking to understand why Jean Calvin and his colleagues allowed the continued participation of godparents in the baptismal ceremony. Yeah, that will be interesting. What role godparents played after baptism, and why Genevans persisted in valuing this position so highly. The fifth chapter focuses on baptism of a particular set of Genevan infants, illegitimate children. It explores the ways in which church and city authorities use the ceremony of baptism, and in particular the baptismal registries, to enforce paternal responsibility to children born out of wedlock, and likewise the ways in which parents themselves use the ceremony of baptism in their efforts to conceal illegitimacy or to ensure the care of their children. Interesting. It also considers the theological complications involved in baptizing children produced by illicit sexual unions. And finally, chapter 6 looks beyond baptism to the raising of children in the Genevan community, considering how the relationships represented in the baptismal ceremony played out in the life of the child, and the way that parents, city leaders, and church authorities negotiated their often distinct vision for the children of their society. Looking at a single city over the course of the first 3 decades of the Reformation will permit us to analyze the interplay between ministers and church members, theology and religious practice, and the Reformation as envisioned and as carried out in daily life. Theological concepts, social concerns influence one another in both subtle and dramatic ways. Infant baptism provides an excellent instrument for studying that ongoing interaction and negotiation. Taken all together, the following chapters reveal the significant role of the sacrament of infant baptism in defining the Reformed Genevan community and creating a place for the baptized child in that the community. That's the finish of chapter 1, or the introduction of infant baptism in Reformation Geneva. And this is by Karen Spierling. And we'll end there today and pick up chapter 2 next time we jump into this one.